Hi there. Welcome to today's conversation. I'm Anna Robbins, president of Acadia Divinity College, but I also direct the Andrew D. McRae Center for Faith and Culture. And the McRae Center has a goal of helping Christians to engage the culture in which we live well. And that sometimes means tackling issues of justice or of meaning or of human flourishing. And today we're going to tackle one of those related issues. We often have these McRae red sofa discussions where I love to have guests sit on the sofa and we have a relaxed conversation together about something that is important. Unfortunately, of course, in these days, we can't have everybody in person. So we have the sofa here, but not in the room, but joining us online, we have Dr. Danny Zacharias, who teaches New Testament here at Acadia Divinity College. He is also our NAITS liaison with the NAITS, an Indigenous learning community. And Danny, I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about yourself, but what would you like people to know as we start out?
No, most people know me. I think that's sufficient. I'm a husband and a father and a follower of Jesus. Happy and privileged to be working here.
Great. And a valued member of our faculty. And Danny also comes from a Cree background. And so he not only is our liaison with NAITS, but he also teaches with NAITS and is part of the Indigenous working group for the Canadian Baptists of Atlantic Canada. Also joining us from Deer Island, New Brunswick is Dr. Lois Mitchell. So great to have you with us, Lois. Lois teaches at St. Stephen's University in New Brunswick. She's also part of a fishing family who have been fishing from Deer Island for generations, and is also part of the Indigenous working group of the Canadian Baptists of Atlantic Canada. Is there anything, Lois, that you would like people to know about you as we begin?
No, I'm sure people will get to know me if they don't already through our conversation.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thanks for being here with me, both of you. If not on the red sofa, at least with that spirit in mind of talking through what has become a really heated issue here in Nova Scotia. And I think one of the reasons I thought it would be good for us to address it, at least in some way, is because it seems to be so heated. And it seems that people are lining up on different sides of this issue. And I can't help but think that if we can learn to talk about these complex things together as Christians, that there might be a great deal that we could learn from it, from others, and about ourselves in the midst of it that will help us to take clearer and better and more effective action in the world. So I think I want to start, Danny, with you because if folks have been on the social media, they will know that a few weeks ago you posted a video that asked people to be interested and concerned about the fishing issue that was emerging down in St. Mary's Bay in Nova Scotia. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what that was and why you felt that was important to do that at that time.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I was part of the Indigenous working group that was commissioned by the denomination towards responding to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. And as a denomination, we wanted to respond appropriately. And I think a lot of us on the group felt that it could so easily just slide by as a vote and a published apology and never go beyond that. And secondly, I recognize how easy it is to talk about problems when they're far away, but when they come up close, when they're now in your province, when they're now just down the way a little, what does it mean to actually hold to things that you vote on, things that you are convicted by? And so with trepidation, I made that post on September 25th. I think it was a Friday afternoon. And I had been thinking about it through the week and was a little nervous about doing it because I'm one who avoids conflict. But I felt I could lean on the resolution that we made, the affirmation of things like the UNDRIP and the Royal Proclamation and the Supreme Court, and could simply just make a call to our denominational body and fellow pastors, ordained and parishioners, and just say we have taken a position of solidarity on these things in terms of treaty rights for the Indigenous peoples. And so I urge them to write or call the relevant officials to make sure that it's on the top of their priority, because that's the lack of conversation and the lack of decision making in those areas really has led in large part to what we're seeing now. And so I did that on, like I said, September 25th, and shortly after, we were working as a working group as well to put out a statement by the working group on behalf of the denomination, or for the denomination. That came out October 1st.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful background, Danny. Thanks for that. I'm aware that not many days afterwards, Lois, you wrote a lengthy piece that was also responding to the issues, some of the issues that have been raised, and it caught a lot of people's attention as well. And I wonder if you would just fill us in with what prompted you to write the piece that you did as well, and how you're thinking about that now.
So it was a very lengthy piece, and I guess I would just preface it by saying, just kind of to go along with what Danny's saying, because I'm also a member of the racism working group, the Indigenous Relations Working Group, and previously I was on the racism working group, and also worked for our denomination for a number of years, into almost 2 decades, I think, in the area of public witness and social concern. So I live in a world where I am constantly thinking through issues of justice and injustice. And we'll get maybe into that a little bit more. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity, for this conversation with the three of us, and hopefully to engage many other people, because I think this is just an amazing moment for us to come to terms with a lot of our history, a lot of our theology. And there's just such an opportunity for us to actually do something productive and effective. That's completely in keeping with who we are as a people and who God calls us to be as witnesses of His word and His presence in our community. So I don't even know where to start the story, but why I wrote this. But my family were largely, my son especially, and my daughter were really pushing me to write something. The Indigenous Relations Working Group, we'd had a meeting, and they had thought it would be helpful to, I think I'm right in saying that they thought it would be helpful for me to put something in writing.
Yeah, that's right.
So it was pretty lengthy. It was 8 pages, I think, single spaced, typewritten. And that's only just the tip of the iceberg of the detail that I would love to, for people to understand. So I married my husband Dale 35 years ago and moved to Deer Island, which is a fishing community, and therefore stepped into a long kind of family heritage of fishing here. His ancestors settled in this area in the late 1700s, and so he's, I don't know, 6th or 7th generation of fishermen here. And so his perspective and the perspective of fishing communities often, I think, is not really known or understood by people. And so as quickly this situation was escalating, it seemed that the narrative wasn't as complete as I felt it needed to be in order for people to be like really effectively in an informed way engaged in either action of like on the ground in Nova Scotia, or via, communicating with elected officials, or just various ways people would want to show their support of the root issues. And it seemed like the narrative was being controlled by the media and by, politicians. And it just really prompted me to kind of encourage people to stand back a bit and to understand how complex these issues are. And there's no, unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a quick fix. And I would say before this, during this and at this moment, I do think our government officials are failing all parties. They're not recognizing in a way that's in a meaningful way Indigenous treaty rights and all of the interpretation of things that came out of the Marshall decision in 1999 and the Marshall clarification called Marshall II. And, I think I was concerned that people were ready to jump in, but without wanting to actually do the background work to understand the issues from the various perspectives. So that was kind of and initially I wrote that and it was kind of addressed more to the CBAC. And then how you do, I posted it on Facebook. I took out a little bit of the direct reference to CBAC, but just kind of left it as it was. And as with Facebook, it takes on a life of its own. Once you put something there, it goes, far beyond your own circle of friends who know you. So the relationship aspect gets muddy really quickly because people are responding to what they assume that you think and say rather than to who you are. And so it's been an interesting and stressful month or month and a half for me. And I'm sure the stress that I have is nothing compared to what people living in Sauniaville, the St. Mary's Bay area have experienced, or other people that are more directly involved in this particular issue have experienced.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for that introduction. I think that helpfully sets the scene. I'm really keen that we not get down into the weeds of the issue, because I think part of what's happened is that, after an initial affirmation of standing with Indigenous people, and then people get kind of fired up and say, yes, we will do this. And then the issues start to emerge as, there's conservation and there's self-government and there's settler relations and there's all this stuff that emerges. And then people say, oh, it is complicated. I guess I'll back off. And then my concern is that then people don't do anything. So I'm always interested to know how we can, sift through the issues, still with people with particular issues can dig down into whatever part of that very complex reality they want. But how do we move through this in a way that enables us to continue to learn to walk well together and not lose focus of that need to walk well together as we are, those of us who are settlers in Mi'kma'ki, we regularly acknowledge that we're on this land that is traditional and unceded territory, that we are all treaty people. What does that mean day to day when we walk through our lives? So I'm wondering what some of the issues you think have emerged that we can really sink our teeth into, without losing sight of the need to continue to persevere, to take action, to walk well together. What would you see as some of what's the key issue here that we need to really tackle? Either of you like to jump in first?
I'll take a shot at it, Danny, if you don't mind to start, because I think those are great questions. And I think, especially as I think about spreading out from the kind of the epicenter of this particular issue for those churches in that immediate area, like it is, if they wanted to avoid it, they probably can't avoid it. It has had such an impact on communities. So how do we engage really well? And I think in one way, the heartbreaking part of this for me, I think in some ways it has set back our efforts towards peace and reconciliation, like as an unfortunate byproduct. And part of the reason for that is I feel the media and government and just the way our communication in these days works. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of things that have created the context within which I think that is true, that is setting back, hopefully in a way that will launch us forward. But I think there has been a step back from reconciliation. And it's because as the media and government officials kind of control the narrative on these things, the people on the ground, and I've heard of pastors in that area who are just heartbroken because they've been working really diligently to build relationship. And then all of a sudden, the wharves and the places where people normally meet within the communities have become very tense. And so the stepping forward part for me is always going to be in relationship. And I think that social media doesn't help in some of those things, because it's very easy for people to feel that they're defensive, or their backs are against the wall, and they say and do things that don't move the conversation forward. So I think the first thing people probably need to do is remember that to humanize the situation. And the best way to do that is to actually talk to people, to be in relationship with people, and to hear one another's perspectives, to hear about the complexity, not from just reading, which we should do. People should read the treaties. They should read the Marshall decision. It's all available online. And I think, to have a sense for what it is we are supporting. And Danny and I both were part of putting the resolution to the convention, the Canadian Baptists of Atlantic Canada. Putting the resolution out is really an important step, but it's only one of many. So now the onus, I think, is on us as leaders in the denomination to give direction, to say, these are some of the things, resources that you can use to help. But even before that, it's like having a mindset that is willing to engage with the difficult aspects of this issue, the difficult aspects of Canadian history, to not want to avoid a sense of responsibility and guilt for the actions of our governments and our, the whole colonial system that has so infiltrated. It's so much a part of our daily lives. So doing the hard work of coming to terms with that, and not responding, not thinking, okay, there's a simple solution, there's a simple way forward, because it's not simple. But we will only learn the complexity as we engage with one another.
I'm going to jump in and invite you to come in on this, Danny, but something you said, Lois, I think is hugely significant. And you talked about, I don't know if you used the term, but you certainly mentioned the idea of settler guilt. Mm-hmm. And I can't help but wonder how that plays out in a situation like this, where we then go online, we hit each other at loggerheads, because on the one hand, you've got people who say, perhaps, the issue is very clear. We're going to stand in solidarity with Indigenous people. And now I don't have to deal with my guilt as a settler because I'm an ally. And then on the other hand, you've got folks maybe who will say, I don't know why we have to keep apologizing anyway. Can't we just move on? This is 2020, forget about the past. And then in that way, don't actually accept perhaps an inherited responsibility, if not a guilt, that actually manifests racism in the midst of it. So I'd like to go on and talk about that in a minute, but Danny, I want a chance for you to come in. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have been, one thing that I've been thinking more and more about through this, through the whole dispute, and reflecting on, in particular, the UNDRIP and the nature of treaties themselves as covenants, treaties as covenants, is that we haven't yet grappled in Canada. We certainly haven't the idea of what it means to share sovereignty, to have a hybridized sovereignty, because even in the best of conversations, and I include myself in this, in the ways that I've responded at times, there is still even times like when we go to the conservation issue, for instance, that we still talk about conservation as the undivided sovereignty of Canada being the decider of that. So we still default at times to there being a supreme authority, and that supreme authority is Canada, but that's not the nature of the treaty relationship that's in its origin. And so even when we go back to Marshall, the Marshall decision, even that is still within the bounds of Canada is still the ultimate sovereign, and we need to recognize that what the nature of the treaties were hybridized sovereignties, as it were. So how does that play into what you said about racism? Is that there's still this default to saying yes, but when it ultimately comes to matter most, it's Canada who gets to decide. And that again places, in this case, the Mi'kmaq people as being subject to that, when that wasn't the nature of the treaty relationship. So in part, what we need to do again, and this is true for me as much as anyone else, is we need to continue to educate ourselves, both in reading and, like Lois said, in discussions with people. And I've appreciated, one of the reasons I really appreciated Lois's paper, I know it was probably done with a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, is because she's firmly on the side of upholding treaty rights, and she lives in the reality of a fishing community. So she's she's right in the middle of it, as it were, and so the struggle of trying to want the flourishing of fishing communities, which we all should want, and want the flourishing of Mi'kmaq communities, which we should all want. And for myself, Anna, because I'm increasingly interested in eco-theology, I want the flourishing of lobster too. God is the creator of St. Mary's Bay, and he's Lord of the lobster too. And so we want those things to be respected as well. So those are some of my thoughts on that.
I appreciate that, Danny. I mean, we are so used to, those of us who are Western in our thinking and so on, of looking at a picture and kind of lining it up around our interests in some way. I don't think we do that on purpose, but we are enculturated to do that. And the scriptures, it seems to me, challenge us to how do you privilege others, particularly in an instance where there's a broken relationship? How do you privilege the other, which I think is really the call through the Gospels and the New Testament, to privilege the other, not just to tolerate or put up with, but to privilege. And how do we do that when it seems to me that racism is still so much a part of how we approach the whole picture? Because, you said people will say, yes, but. I hear that a lot, actually. Yes, but. And the but usually is, but I want my rights. I want the advantages that I'm used to having. How do we challenge what I think is, and is it, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but how do we challenge this kind of racist perspective that we don't want to say it's racist? Because no, we love all people. We know Jesus loves all people, but it seems so ingrained that we will always say yes, but. How do we push into that? And I wonder, from both of your personal experiences, how you've wrestled with that, maybe in your own identity. What was your point of awakening? Lois, you once told me about a time in Africa when you had an awakening to the privileged position you had. I don't know if you'd like to reference that.
Yeah, well, as you've been speaking, there's been so many moments, I think, in my last, 30 years where there's just been key moments of awareness and awakening. The result of which I would say today, we live both with systemic racism. I'm aware every morning I wake up and I benefit from systemic racism. Absolutely. But I think it's too easy for us to say there's systemic racism, but I'm not racist. And I would encourage people not to be too quick to either say that or think that. I think we don't know that we're racist until we're in a situation completely out of our comfort zone. I mean, most of us live pretty comfortable lives if we're white settler peoples in Canada. And so fortunately, it's been a long learning curve with various steep moments. The last month and a half has been steep for me because I've really been digging more and more intentionally into the treaties and the background, the Indian Act, the white paper. There's just a lot of bits of information. I don't want to be racist. I will say that. And I think God calls us not to be racist, but I think to too quickly say we're not racist is deceiving ourselves, first of all. And the path forward for me, I've had a number of Indigenous kind of mentors, people whose paths I've crossed sometimes for longer periods and sometimes less. But one of the mentors always talked about walking in a good way with a good mind and a good heart. And this particular person wouldn't consider himself or wouldn't label himself as a Christian, but I think what's any clearer? Walking in a good way with a good mind and a good heart. If every day I get up, I can endeavor to put that into practice, then, like I will encounter my flaws and shortcomings with grace for myself and grace for other people. But I also think it has to be rooted in truth telling. And there's a lot of truth to be told about our current situation. And I totally agree with Danny that the sovereignty issue is something that we just can't quickly sort of come to grips with. It's very complicated. In a sense, like how we have got to where we are today. And if we could turn back the clock and say, oh, like, how do we so quickly get off that path of peace and friendship that the peace and friendship treaties were prescribing for this ongoing relationship? But we are, all of us, society has gone in some ways very badly wrong on the terms on which that peace and friendship treaty was established. And I think that's where we have to be willing to do the hard work of saying, how can we get back to that? How can we get back to a relationship based on peace and friendship and mutual sovereignty? The Indian Act, people need to understand the Indian Act in Canada and need to understand how it came into being, the impact, efforts to ratify, to replace it, or to abolish it. I mean, back in I forget the year when the white paper came out, 1989, 69 was the white paper. Wow. Okay. So that came out, and the intention of the white paper was to abolish the Indian Act. And I don't know if the government naively thought that Indigenous peoples would embrace this, because the Indian Act was the thing that basically was founded on the idea that it would take the Indian out of the child, which led to the residential schools and all of the practices and the relationship between federal government and Indigenous peoples and communities. But to replace the Indian Act with the white paper, it was just explicitly trying to put it in terms that sounded like equality, but basically saying you will be completely and fully integrated and assimilated into Canadian society. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of outcry across the nation from Indigenous peoples that just flatly rejected that concept. Now I've heard and I see evidence of it being true, that the white paper, even though it wasn't adopted, that it is still motivating the actions of the federal government to this day. And I think on the one hand, the sad part for me is, as I look at today, like what's going on with the lobster dispute, I think nothing is going to change. I think the commercial seasons are about to open. I think the mediator has been appointed. There has been an injunction to kind of deal with the immediate violence. The government has now the opportunity to retreat, deflect, delay, deny, and it makes me incredibly sad, because at the cost of disrupting relationships in all kinds of communities in Nova Scotia, Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. All of this has been so disruptive, and I hope I'm wrong, but I think unless there is intervention, wise, intelligent, informed intervention, this is an opportunity for the churches to take the lead. Unless there is that kind of intervention, nothing will change. We'll be back in another year or 5 years. There'll be another Burn Church, Saunieville explosion, and it's sad and unnecessary in my view.
I can just add a little bit to that, Anna.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally there with Lois. I'm teaching Romans and Galatians right now, and in the midst of Romans, we're talking about how Paul talks about sin not only as something that resides and comes out of the own human heart, but also that it's an oppressive power. It's a system, and that's, when you're asking that question about racism, it's the individual racist that's easy to spot. It's the oppressive systems that's not. And for any Canadian who is a Canadian citizen to say, I don't benefit from racism, as soon as you live in a country with something called the Indian Act, I mean, it's built into our legislation, and like you said, and you're right, the white paper, even though it wasn't adopted, it's like this modus operandi that's continued to be used. And just to remind people again, for those watching, I presume a lot of them are from our constituency. The resolution to adopt the UNDRIP is a mandate to dismantle the Indian Act on the terms of Indigenous people, so that we return back to treaty relationships. So I just wanted to throw that in.
I want to come and build on that a little bit, Danny, because we've probably all heard folks in our churches say things like, how many times do we have to apologize? Do we need to keep going on? Why, well, everybody now lives in Canada. Why can't they live like we do? And all of that sort of thing. When the very understanding of what it means to be Indigenous has been treated as an anathema for so long in our history. And I wonder, Danny, if you could reflect just a little bit on your own personal journey, with that. I mean, I was at the innate symposium a couple of years ago, sitting in a talking circle with a young man who said he grew up in Winnipeg, learning to hate the Indian in him. And it's heartbreaking, truly heartbreaking. And I think it's when we hear stories like that of what it means to be alienated from your identity and trying to discover an identity and so on, that we realize, wow, actually, we have been very assimilative, very disrespectful of diversity, very unaware of our oppressive role potentially, and in reality as settlers in the land. Danny?
Yeah. Well, like some people have heard me say, I'll say it again, that the only people who could outsing my family in gospel music were the Gaithers themselves. We pressed hard. Yeah, we pressed hard into our the Christian identity, and in some respects, I think that was simultaneously in an effort to suppress Indigenous identity because of the discrimination, in particular of my mom's generation, so my aunts and uncles, and then my grandparents. So on my mother's side, this is where I'm Cree on my mother's side. So I had the benefit when I was a child of not encountering that at the same level, and in that it was not directed at me, although it was certainly around me. So typical unfortunate racist jokes that get passed along as you're teaching each other at grade level, the bad words in English and in French, and bad jokes. The jokes were always aimed at Indigenous people. So that was kind of the reality I grew up in. But because it was suppressed in my family, in some sense, I didn't really even realize, oh, this is part of my heritage, because it was suppressed for a long time. And it's been, a process for me of rediscovery of myself and of my heritage. And for me, it's the theological questions too, of what does it mean to be then an Indigenous follower. So we very much we looked like a white Christian family in that way. But there was these recognitions too that we weren't always exactly the same as everyone else, right? So we were whitewashed for sure in that way. And this is like you said, you've heard, and my journey is the journey of thousands of people across Canada of rediscovering their identity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that, Danny. Go ahead, Lois.
If I could just and if I'm getting into the weeds, just
Will do.
I think one of the challenges for me, okay, and hopefully I'm not going to lose my train of thought, but I think I need to say, it's the nature of these kind of disputes. And again, I'm going to say the media kind of controlling the narrative pits people against one another, and so the assumption is that you are on one side or the other side. And then, there's a friend and colleague of mine talks about the autocomplete function. When you go to type a word and Facebook or Messenger or whatever, it helps you out by just finishing your thought. So this idea that once you're identified as being, like for me, I think people would say and have said, well, this is very personal for you. And it is, but it's not just personal on the fishing side. Like I feel that I am committed to, the things that we set out in our resolution. But that gets lost really quickly, so that everything that I might say gets filtered through this lens of I am at the end of the day supporting fishing. And in a way, I would say that my hope is that in keeping with like walking in a good way with a good mind and a good heart and truth telling, that I don't want to see families like ours, the heritage that they have, it is like a sacred trust. Like when our son went off on his own, we explicitly said, don't be the person in our family line that messes up and that loses this opportunity for fishing. Anyway, that's another whole part of the story. But in terms of identity, I think my PhD was in sociology and my thesis was on the Deer Island fishing economy. So anyway, and not to go into a lot of detail in that, but I think for the identity piece, it would surprise people to know that as much as the commercial traditional fishermen these days benefit from colonialism, benefit from privilege, from the racism that is inherent in our systems, as much as they benefit from that, they are the low-hanging fruit, and they are the ones whose identity is next in line to be eradicated. And I say that with absolute just conviction that the stakes are incredibly high in this. So I want us to find a path forward based on peace and reconciliation, peace and friendship. But again, I think that how we find that path, there aren't, as I keep coming back to, there's no real quick fix. The Indian Act has unfortunately been, in so many cases, successful in separating Indigenous peoples from their core identities. To sort of presume that we can just say, okay, well, we're going to stop doing that, and we're going to suddenly recognize all of the rights and the sovereignty that should have been recognized and the base of our relationship all of these years. And so, what if fishermen and fishing communities are the casualty of that? Well, that's just the way it is. That's the cost that it is. And aside from the fact that would have a direct impact on my family, my community, it would have an impact on thousands of communities in Atlantic Canada. And so I think the wisdom that's needed because I think it's fully possible to achieve the outcome that is just and fair, respectful of the treaty rights. I think it's possible to achieve that, but without sacrificing the next low-hanging fruit, to take the identity of fishermen and say, you have to be separated from your culture in order to wrong this or correct this wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
So you guys, I'm mindful that we will want to take some Q&R in just a moment, but I have what I will call one last question. I'll go to you with it first, Danny, and you can pick up on that if there's something you want to respond to. How then, if we are to be ambassadors of reconciliation, which I believe firmly that's what we are set in this world to be, if we've been reconciled to God in Christ, we are to be ambassadors of reconciliation. Then what on earth does that look like? First of all, how do we hang together as believers in Christ, even though we might seem to fall on sides? How do we keep that from tearing us apart? And second of all, then how are we able to take actions that speak for justice, which is what seems to be motivating the hearts of so many? They see something that seems wrong. They want to act. They want to do something. How can we do that without furthering the hurt? Danny, I'll come to you first, and do pick up on that last point if you want to first.
Yeah. Well, I just want to pick up on something, what Lois was talking about, and she said this in part in what she wrote and posted, is the difficulty with how things go forward is so often that, once again, it becomes a top-down decision rather than a decision in conversation. So, there's lots of money was spent after the Marshall decision, but that was often, it has been seen by the Mi'kmaq community as paternalistic decisions made on their behalf, rather than that, following that, what we often say of nothing about us without us, right? So it happens in conversation, and like Lois said, now the same thing potentially, or maybe is already happening, might be the better way to say it, for individual fishers, where they are left out of conversations at times, and don't feel that they're heard, and that's not the way to move forward. It's through that dialogue and process. So regarding your question, I hate to feel like a broken record because I say it so often, but it really does go back to educating yourself. And part of our resolution was in response to the UNDRIP, and it's not the UNDRIP, so the TRC calls to action. And part of the calls to action for the churches was to educate yourself and educate your congregation on the history of Canada, on the nature of treaties, on the residential schools and things like that. And we've tried to do that. That was part of the work of the working group. But this has, unfortunately, it ends up that something like this flares up, and then people realize they don't know very much about it. And then maybe they rush. And then, like you said, they feel they don't know what to say, rather than, I wish after that assembly that we would have had a lot more influx into the course that we had created than we did, but we didn't, and that's the reality. I realize everyone's busy, but then we come to a time like this where people don't know what to think, because they don't have just that basic knowledge about Canadian history and the nature of, what does it mean when we say we're all treaty people? Why would we talk about this as unceded territory? I mean, those basic questions, people don't always know how to respond. So it really does start with educating ourselves and trying to educate our communities. I'm interested to hear from Lois and from you, if you were in a pulpit, for instance, during this past month, what would be passages you might go to? What would be, sermons that you might want to preach? Because I think that there's probably a lot of our students and our constituency who are perhaps afraid to, and so they just continue going on with the sermon series that they had planned all along, which I can understand in some sense, right? But I think to be ambassadors of reconciliation and to be prophets in our hometowns means sometimes breaking the sermon series and courageously encountering issues of the day. And so I'm interested to hear what both of you think too.
Well, I'll go to Lois. You first.
I said I meant to brush up on my theology this week before this conversation. But the thing that came to mind, Danny, was I was in El Salvador, and I don't know what year it was, but the last Sunday that we were there, David Nachos was preaching at the church in San Salvador. And he preached on being peacemakers. And he talked about, like there's a whole difference between being a lover of peace and being and the difference between just loving peace and being a peacemaker, and like being involved actively in promoting peace. And, I think people have I don't know what I would say, honestly. I don't know what I would say. And I know that as Anna has mentioned, like every congregation, I assume, has people that would be coming into this issue from very different perspectives and points of view. I used to think one of my sort of real learning moments that preceded the racism working group was this kind of, I had a conversation with someone, and I thought, well, like if equality means that everyone has sort of, every person on earth has one unit of space, and that's sort of, everyone's equal, they have one unit of space. But then if people have been oppressed or have been discriminated against and have been forced to be to occupy less space, then the first step towards reconciliation or peace building would be to allow for them to spread out and occupy more. Like, if you've been cramped up, like to give that freedom for people to have more space. And I think in some ways people might be willing to do that, but after a while they think, well, really, you're taking up too much space now. And I think navigating that are how we respond to kind of those feelings of, defensiveness around our own space, and the generosity, I think, Anna, you had mentioned with, the promoting of other people, to allow, to create space for people to kind of stretch and overcome centuries, generations of being oppressed. I think having sort of a mindset that values that. And, we've, in some ways, I think one of the opportunities with COVID and with challenging situations like the fishing dispute, it should push us back into our theology. It should push us to look for wisdom from how do we live well in the world as it is today. And I think just encouraging honesty, encouraging transparency and authenticity, and seeing one another, which is another one of my key takeaways, to see people and to hear from them, and without the presumption, like to let people speak for themselves is critical.
That's a huge, significant challenge, I think, Lois. And just as we go and take a couple of questions, I hope we'll have time for at least a couple. You asked the question, Danny, so I'll answer it. I mean, that's what the whole McRae Center encourages, is people to engage with what's happening, not to seal ourselves off from the world as if we're some kind of alternate reality. God became incarnate in Jesus Christ into this world and engaged with all of the issues and the realities and did not hide away. So I think we're called for that kind of incarnational full engagement, and we're sent as ambassadors. That means we're not in exile. We don't circle the wagons against the world. We go out and we embrace it. We encounter it. We share Jesus both in our words, but also in our lives. And so, absolutely drop the sermon series and tackle the issues that your people are coming to church thinking about, and help them to think biblically about it. What passages would I turn to on this issue? I'd go to Ahab and Naboth's vineyard. Absolutely. Because it deals with the land and who gets to own the land. And the land was traditionally Naboth's, but Ahab had the power to take it from him. And these are great passages that enable us to step back from our own emotions and to see it in another frame, in the same way that that the prophet was able to come to King David and say, you're that guy. And we can then feel the Spirit telling us, well, actually that's you. And then we can wrestle with that with the Lord. And I think then come on to a much better path. Even when we look at the whole formation of the New Testament church, when an otherness, a difference was encountered, they would meet together and they'd say, what do we do about this? Do we chuck that out? And then most often what they said was they'd think about it, they'd pray about it, and they'd say, no, there's a place for this. And by embracing it, it changed all of them, but they were willing to take that risk because it was a Spirit directed change. It wasn't like the gospel itself was changing and so on. We think we're protecting God sometimes, and God's able to do that. And in actual fact, I think instead we're protecting ourselves. But this isn't about me, it's about you guys. So I'm just answering that question. We have Chris Johnson, who works with us here at the McRae Center. Chris, are there any questions online that you want to chuck over to us? Okay.
One question is, how do we steer people away from this either-or narrative towards working together in love and mutual respect?
I don't know if you could hear that. It's a great question. How do we steer people away from this either-or mentality towards working together with mutual respect? How do we do that? Great question. Who wants to jump in first? Danny, how about you?
Oh, yeah, it is a tough question. I guess it's always and I'm learning just this, I would say just as much as anyone, is what Lois emphasized, of always striving to hear the other side and if you can, to hear from an actual person rather than from a magazine article. Because when we automatically choose that one side, then sometimes we entrench ourselves unwittingly, right? So to try and recognize there's genuine people with genuine concerns on both sides, and unfortunately there are malicious people on both sides as well. That's the reality we live in. But I would just say it's trying to remain open and honest and listen. Many of the things that we've said already.
Thank you, Danny. Lois?
Yeah, I'd just say, I totally agree with that. I think maybe stay off Facebook.
It's good advice for all of us, Lois.
But I think ask questions though, like as you hear about the situation, whatever your source of information is, like ask questions and then, there's all kinds of ways you can find answers for questions. The best one is people with lived experience. So again, I'd say, talk to people who know more about the situation than you do. But there's all kinds of information online that if you have a specific question, go to Google and find the information. And I've had amazing conversations with people who maybe it started on Facebook, that pushed back on something, and I said, let's have coffee, and we've had great conversations. So I think it is possible to do that, and yeah.
It feels risky to meet someone who thinks very differently from you, but the risk, it's got to be worth it, right? Meet and have a coffee, bring someone into the conversation who's human. Great responses. Thanks both. Another question. Maybe two more. Mm-hmm.
This is a question that wasn't actually posed, but it's going on in the chat. I want to hear.
Okay, there's conversation going on, and this is a question emerging.
Yeah, so it said, let's see. I saw lots of preachers and churches willing to drop their sermon series when the Black Lives Matter movement started to kick off. How come they've been unwilling to do so?
That is a great question. And the question is, the question being posed is that a lot of pastors did seem to drop their sermon series to address the Black Lives Matters issue, but not with this. Response to that, why you think that is?
Proximity. It's proximity. It's the willingness to engage often with things that aren't close to home that may ruffle feathers close by. I think that's a big part of it. I think. I mean, it's not the only part, but I think it's a big part.
Right. It's easier to speak about an issue that's over there than one that's right here in our own congregation, let alone community. Lois?
Yeah, well, and part of me thinks, well, if people were willing to engage with Black Lives Matter, like that surprises me that they wouldn't want to say, oh, wow, like if we've recently talked about Black Lives Matter, a lot of the same foundational concepts are at play. And here's one that really is going to impact us very directly. It really does impact. I mean, in many communities, Black Lives Matter, like there's so much common ground in so many issues beyond those two, but to look for the connections, of which I think will then drive us to both our history, but another comment that I had thought of earlier was we don't know our history, but we also don't know our present. Like we don't know how decisions get made. We don't understand. We live in a democracy, but we don't really know how, regulations and legislation and laws like come into effect. And in order to engage really well in these conversations, I think logically and naturally, organically, we'll be finding out more about the current realities of the Canadian society. So I think, I imagine if there's reluctance to take this on from the pulpit, it probably is out of a sense of fear, a sense of not knowing enough. And so if we're not prepared the day the crisis comes to a head, then, I think it requires a whole shift in our way of thinking to say, okay, I need to be prepared. I need to understand these issues and invite people on that journey. I mean, I think if pastors will take the lead and say, I don't know enough about this, and I don't know even how theology speaks to me on this particular issue today, then lead by example, like do the work, and then invite people to join you in that journey.
Thank you. And, I think we want to say, yes, preach about Black Lives Matter more and more and more. But I do think that a lot of people, that issue somehow seems more obvious to them. Maybe they know Black Christians, and so they're able to speak to something that they have experienced for themselves. And I don't wonder that sometimes people don't actually know Indigenous people to be able to personify that as a human issue of racism in the same way. I'm just speculating, but I do wonder about that. But absolutely, it's got to be the same. It's got to be the same theology that feeds these things, and they're not in competition. It's not whose pain is greatest. It's about, again, the whole justice call to walk well with one another, regardless.
As you've even said, Anna, you can ask the question, why don't I know these? Why don't I know Indigenous people in this
Absolutely.
area? And you dig far back and you know why. You start to understand why and how systems of oppression have placed them in very small areas due to the So anyway, which you've said nicely in the past about coming back from being on hiatus in Atlantic Canada, and all of a sudden there are now signs of Mi'kmaq communities close by, whereas growing up you never saw that.
No, we never saw that. We had no idea where people lived. No idea. And then coming back, suddenly there's road signs that say, did you know there's a First Nations community here and one here? I'm like, wow, how on earth did we grow up in this land and never know that? And that's indicting, right? We really have to own these kinds of things. Anyway, it's not my preach. Go ahead, Chris.
The ideal final question.
Okay, the ideal final question. Great.
Came early.
Yeah.
How can we as Christians best show our support to the Mi'kmaq people, and what are the next steps we can take away?
Great. So I don't know if you heard it, but how can we as Christians best support the Mi'kmaq people at this time? And what was the second part?
What are some next steps?
And what are some next steps? So we learn, we educate ourselves. What are the next steps we need to take? Lois?
Why don't you go first? Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Next steps. I'm thankful that it seems like less of a crisis today than it did a few weeks ago. The violence seems to have subsided. I think it does give us an opportunity for careful consideration of next steps. And I do think that, there's probably a couple of different tracks. So there's the theological part, which should be the foundation of going forward as Christians. As a kind of a heads up for people, because I think, it's always a concern, like how much do you just sort of try to help people on this journey without trying to steer that, because the journey will probably be a little bit different for everyone. But one of the things that I've really wrestled with, in a sense, which will impact how people go into this. Like if they say, okay, this is it, I am going to sign up for the CBAC course that's going to help me be informed. I'm going to take an online MOOC. I'm going to get to know Indigenous peoples and have conversations. One of the things we watched in my Education for Reconciliation class last week, the movie, which is it's not a documentary, it's a movie called Indian Horse, based on the novel by Richard Wagamese. And there's a moment in the movie, and I try not to do a spoiler alert, but there's a moment at which Saul Indian Horse, who's this amazing hockey player and is really close to kind of breaking through and becoming a professional hockey player, and a lot of pressure on him, like you just put up with the racism that you're experiencing because you're almost to the other side. And it's a bit heartbreaking, actually, because as we unpacked it after watching the movie, thinking about how do we define success. And so for many, like breaking through that racism to be a success when he can model that for other people, like that's presuming a little bit, I think, based on the influence of the Indian Act, that the best way for Indian people to be Indigenous people in society today, the best way is for them to succeed according to the worldview of colonial Canada. And like there's a scene where he's just scored a goal. He's like flat on the ice, face down, and people are throwing the little cowboy and Indian figurines. They're throwing them on the ice, and it's a powerful moment. And part of me wanted him to sort of pick up one of the Indian figures, kind of hold it up, maybe kiss it and tuck it in his jersey and just kind of say, I'm Indigenous and I'm here. So that part of me wanted to, and I've got to still think about why did I want that to be the outcome? But he doesn't. He shortly after that gives up hockey. Like hockey has been ruined for him. The beauty of the game has been ruined for him. But I think, we need to be careful about our assumptions going into a learning exercise to understand the important differences between a colonial worldview. We live in a colonial culture that has imbued with values and ideas that are colonial, Western. and they're our reality, but they aren't all the options. And I think lots of people today are seeing the beauty and the value in Indigenous worldviews and cultures. And I think there's this longing, as we recognize the failures of colonial society, there's this longing to have access to the worldviews and cultures of Indigenous peoples. And but we need to be really careful, because we could just add more layers. It would be so easy to just add more layers of racism from a very, an intention to be respectful and open and wanting to be informed. So I think as we, steps for going forward, I just think we have to go forward, with enthusiasm, but with a degree of caution, that we don't become victims of another layer of colonial cultural appropriation or whatever it is. I just think we have to lay ourselves bare and ask God to guide and direct us in all of this.
Yeah. Thank you, Lois. Danny, you get the last word.
Okay. Well, so, I mean, we've said it numerous times, but educating ourselves, the question of how to support the Mi'kmaq people is, I think, for you to be able to say that you're a treaty person in this land and understand what that means is going to go a long way. So what does it mean to say that you are part of a treaty here and that you are a settler, or someone from away? I'm not Indigenous to this land either. I'm a guest here as well. So to support Mi'kmaq people and their treaty rights is not to deny the rights to other people. Again, that's the nature of the treaty. Mi'kmaq people don't want to deny the rights of local fishermen. They want the equal right to flourish as well. And so to support Mi'kmaq rights does not mean to not support the rights of fishermen and other people in this land. And that's really important for us to recognize. And so we want to, again, I keep going back to the word flourish, human flourishing. We want that for all people equally. And we need to recognize what that means for the original settlers, for the original peoples of this land. So I go back to that first video again that I did, and pointing people to say that, and Lois said there's been a failure on the part of the government to define basic things like the core reason, not the core reason, but one of the big reasons why the fishing went forward this year for moderate livelihood is because they've been patient in trying to work with the government to say, let's define this together, not you define it for me and then impose it, but let's do it together. And that didn't happen. And so they said, we're going to move forward as best we can in a good way. It wasn't ad hoc. They spent time, they did their research. They have conservation in mind too. So we need to recognize that all of these things are in play. And as we go forward, we need to call people to account for not speaking into the issue when it's their job to. I think of the DFO in particular. And I think every pastor has done this on either side of the debate. You fall, all of us denounce any racist acts and destruction of property and things like that. But I do want people to realize that even though it's only come to your attention in the last 2 months, Mi'kmaq fishermen have been dealing with cut lobster traps by the DFO for years and years and years. This is not anything new for them. It's just that it's flared up and now it's in your news feed. So again, we need to educate ourselves and recognize, and you don't learn these things until you come into contact and conversation and relationship with Indigenous folks.
Thanks so much. There's so much we could continue to talk about and chase, and maybe we'll have another conversation some months down the road when we see where things are. I hope that those who are watching feel challenged, encouraged, and willing to keep taking steps forward. I think it's really important that as Christians, we don't hide away and that we seek friendship with people who are very different from ourselves without, as you said, Lois, without being paternalistic about it and thinking that we're the ones who go in and fix everything. It's a slow process of being real and related to one another, but also having the courage to step into hard conversations with listening and with seeing and sharing. So I'm thanking you both for that today, and enabling the McRae Center to be able to do that, to step into difficult conversations and hopefully learn something from them, so that not so that we can then say, isn't it great, we now have lots of interesting knowledge, but so that we are actually empowered to act as servants of Jesus Christ in this world, who, as you say, Danny, want the flourishing of all people. So thank you both for being here. Thanks to everyone for your questions and conversation, and for being here. And bless us all today. At Acadia Divinity College, we are treaty people of 1752, and looking to figure out what that means for us. God bless you.
Thank you very much.